Let's look at file input and output one more time with another example. This is going to be similar to the last example where we had the fixed length records, where you had the file where each field was a specific length of a specific number of characters. The difference in this case, though, is that they're not length delimited, but rather they are pipe delimited, meaning there's a special character between each field. That way we know where one field ends and a new one begins. So this one, and that structure is a lot more practical. It's easier to use and easier to maintain and parse and all that stuff. So this is much more realistic, having some kind of a character delimited file. A very common one is comma separated file, or a CSV. Is very common, and those are basically comma delimited fields. But in this case, we're going to load in a pipe delimited file using the variable p, which holds the path to the file. So it's organized with 3 fields on each line. So there's going to be multiple lines for each record, and then instead of having all the records on one line, it's going to be easier to read, it's just much easier. And it looks kind of like this. So you're going to have a first name, then a pipe, then the last name, another pipe, and then the birthday. Okay, and that's going to be one line, and any additional records is going to be formatted the exact same way on subsequent lines. Okay, so our goal here is to search for the first name and the last name, and then replace the birthday where the first and last name match. So it's basically the same end goal as the previous example where we used the fixed length records. The only difference is that the file format is different. Also, Codio is giving us some framework kind of. They're giving us the kind of a blueprint. They want us to use some functions here. They're giving us some information, and we'll be using functions. So this is a much more practical example for the real world. All right. So firstly, you'll have the import sys, and then you're getting some variables. Now remember, since I don't have Codio to run this against, I'm setting my values manually. You will not want to do that because these are actually going to come from Codio. So make sure you're not manually or hard coding any values for these variables. All right, but P is the path for the value that we're going to, the file that we're going to read in, and then ultimately write out the changes to. F is going to be the first name to look for, L is the last name to look for, and B is the birthday to change when we find the first and last name. All right, so let's start out with these function definitions. We have to put in some information into the body of these functions that will actually make the process of this whole thing work, and then we'll be able to call the functions whenever we need them. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, load this function here is load 2D array from file. So the whole goal of this is to read the values from a file and then put that into a 2-dimensional array. All right, simple enough. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and start reading, open the file for reading, and file path, and then this structure here that I'm using with the with keyword. If you haven't seen that yet, you'll want to check out my basics to file input output video. But basically this is opening it, and then as soon as it finishes the block with this with, it'll automatically close it. So it helps us out a little bit, makes things easier and cleaner. Alright, as, I don't know, read file. Okay, something to that effect. Now, what this is going to do, I'm going to read in, since this has, well, let me show you the structure of the file. The structure that we're reading, the file structure that we're reading is going to look something to this effect. Okay, you'll have one line with each field delimited by a pipe, the pipe character, which is the shift backslash right above the enter, and then you have a new line, which is this, and then a new line with another field, and so on and so forth. You can have as many lines as you want to. They can be as long or as short as needed. So what I want to do is I want to read in the value. Okay, now remember before what I could do and what we used was just this, right? The file, read file.read. And what that does is it would bring back one string that represents the entire file. Okay? I don't want to do that. What I want in this case is I want to read each line individually and put this into a list of values. Okay, so what I'm going to do is read lines, the function read lines. Okay, so your read file.read lines, and what that does is it will read each line individually. Okay, so it's going to read until it finds a new line, and it's going to add that line to a list. Then it's going to read the next line, add that to a list, and so on and so forth all the way down, and then it's going to return that list. So before, when I did just read, okay, that the value in lines is now, it would be just a string, okay, one string. But when I do read lines, the value inside lines is going to be a list of strings, okay? So I hope that makes sense. Now what I want to do is I'm going to declare some kind of a my list that I will ultimately be sending back as that I'll be returning, okay? Because this function is supposed to load the value, the file contents, and then put them into a two-dimensional array, and then what I'll do is I'll return that value from the function. Okay, so I'm going to declare and initialize my resulting list, which will be a list of lists. I'm going to return that. It's two-dimensional. I'm going to return that list of lists at the end, so I could even do something like this and just get it. Make sure I don't forget return result. Okay, that just kind of gives you a little room to work with, so you know you're not going to forget to return the result. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to loop through each of the lines that was returned. Okay, so remember, when I call read lines, it's going to return a list that has each line as an element, and that's inside this list called lines. So I'm going to say for line in lines, right? So when so lines is the list, and when this loop initializes, line is going to be the first, line returned, and then it's going to go on to the second one, and so on and so forth. So now I have the line is going to be my string that is delimited, looks something kind of like this one up here, right? Delimited by a pipe character. So what I want to do is I want to just add a list to this result. Okay, so I'm going to go result.append, and I'll tell you what. Let's do this first. So I'm going to create a variable. We'll call it fields for now. Okay, that's going to be a list of all the fields for this line. Okay, and we're going to do line.split. Okay, so remember we've talked about some of the built-in functions on the string object, such as count and replace, I think was another one that we used. And there's another one called split. What that will do is it'll split the string and create a list by splitting it on a certain character within the string. Okay, so you have to specify the character that you want to split on. In this case, we're splitting on the pipe. Okay, if it was a comma delimited file or a comma separated value file, you may want to do a comma, right? That's the delimiter that is separating each field. Okay, so when this line runs, what you'll have is a list that looks something like this. Okay, and when you split, it removes whatever character it is that you split on. So the pipes go away, and you just have what it was between the pipes. So now fields is going to be equal to a list, a string list, a list of strings with each field as an element. Okay, so now what I can do is, let's see, I can just append to the final result the fields. Okay, something like that. Now we're actually going to run into a small problem here just because of the way this file is encoded. So as you can see, it's got each line or each record on its own line, but what you can't see is that right here at the end of the line there's actually a new line character. Okay, you can't see it because it's a white space character. You can't actually, it doesn't display it to the user. It just that's the reason that there's a little split there. But you can kind of see if I select this entire line that at the end here there's a small gap, and that's the new line character being selected. And you can see that my cursor is now blinking on the second line, and that's because there's a new line character there. So when I read this in, right, it's actually putting it in as that, and that will at some point that will cause us a problem. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that that does not get included. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, if the whole string, the whole line looks kind of like this, that's how it's read in, then all we need to do is remove before we actually split, okay, the line, we need to take the line that is this whole string and just remove the ending new line character, okay? And we used this previously in the previous example. We had this function called on it, so that is part of the string function, string object, right? So what we can do is we can just call line.strip. Okay, that'll remove any white space, right? That's the space, the stuff that you can't see. It'll remove any spaces, new lines, tabs, any white space characters from the beginning or the end of the string. Okay, and then if you really wanted to, you could just do an rstrip, which would only strip that white space from the right side of the string. That's what rstrip is. lstrip would be the left side of the string. In our case, we'll just leave it as rstrip. So what it does is it's going to get the line, okay, the whole line, including that new line character. It's going to strip the end of the line, so the right side of the line. It's going to strip that new line character out, and then it's going to split on that pipe delimiter. Now we'll have the fields, and it'll look something like this without the new line character, which is exactly what we want. So now we can just append that into here. Now what I started doing before I switched that out to its own line is I put that in like this. That's the way I was getting ready to do it, and that's just because it's simpler, or it's shorter, it's more simplified, and it achieves the same thing. So this is all one thing. You can imagine that this returns that value that we had before called fields. That's a list, right? And then what I'm doing is I'm appending that list to this list, right? So once I do that for each line, now my result is a list of lists, okay? So that's it for this load 2D array from file. So just to recap here, I'm specifying a parameter. Well, I think Codio puts this in here. They want you to specify the parameter of file path, and that's going to be whatever file you want to open. So this will work for any file path that you pass in here. It'll read it in, provided it follows this structure and it is pipe delimited. Then it will return a list of lists for you with each field parsed out and then split by that delimiter. Okay, so we read the file, put it into lines as a list, and then we loop through each line in that list, take off the new line character at the end, and then split it on the pipe, and then add that to our final result. Once that is done, it'll loop over this many times, loop-de-loop-de-loop, and then we just return the final result. Okay, simple enough. Next function here, we're going to move on. This one is the find. It's called find index. So what this one needs, and since I'm specifying parameters up here, okay, this basically just means that every time this function is called, I need to have these three pieces of information. I need to have the list of records, which is the list of lists. I need to have a first name to look for and a last name to look for inside that list of lists. All right, so first thing to do inside this index is we're just going to start a loop, okay, and I'll do, I don't know, record in records. All right, and I want to point out that anytime you're referencing the variables up that are defined in your parameters, you have to use the name for it. This is declaring a variable. All right, so for the record in records, for each records, let's see, for index. Oh no, you know what I need to do is I need to get the actual index. So I want to do this differently. I want to do index in and then the range of the length of the records. Okay, so let me just kind of show you the reason I need to do this is I need to return the index. If I just go through the records and I do something like I had before, I don't actually know the index of the record that I'm actually currently looking at. So I need to have an index value. That way I have something I can return. Okay, hopefully that'll make a little more sense once I finish up this function call. Or this function definition rather. So now what I need to do is I need to check that record, right? The record at the given index, and check to see if it matches the first and last name. If it does, then I just need to return the index where I found it. So if the records, I should probably spell that right, huh? At the given index. Okay, now remember that this, let me get the actual, just for the sake of being able to see this visually. So I have, when I return from this, right, I've got a list of lists, and it's going to look something kind of like this. There's my full list, starting there and ending there, and each element in the list is a list itself. Okay, and this first list is the first element in this list of lists, and it's at index 0. Okay, and this one here is at index 1, this one's at index 2, and so on and so forth. So when for index in range, that means what it's going to do is it's going to go up to the total number of elements. In this example here, I have 5 elements, so it's going to go from 0 to 5 exclusively, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, but not 5, right? Those are valid, all valid indexes for this list. So for index and list, it's going to start out index at 0, then it's going to go after one iteration, it's going to go to index 1, then it's going to go to index 2 after that iteration, and so on and so forth. So if the record's at index, right, that's going to pull now this whole thing, right? So you could imagine that this, okay, is actually this. Right? I'm not going to leave that there because that won't work in the code, but that's kind of what's happening in Python. Python is going into the records item list here, pulling the list element at index 0, which could be something like this. Now what I need to do is I need to check the first name of that record, and in order to do that, let's say this was just some list object, right? Well, to reference it, you would use, or to index it, you would use the indexer, right? So since that is a list object, I can use the indexer again. Okay, that's how the two-dimensional arrays or the two-dimensional lists work. The list of lists. So records index. Okay, that is going to pull this. Now I need to search inside this list at index 0 for the first name to see if it equals the first name provided. All right, and then I also need to check, I'm going to do the same thing, the last name. Now I have to specify exactly where I'm looking again. Okay, records at the index, we want to make sure we're looking in the same list here, and then instead of searching for index 0, we want to search the last name portion, which is index number 1. Okay, we want to check and see if that one equals the last. If it does, if that is true, so if the first name matches and the last name matches, that means we found the index that we need. We'll just go ahead and return index. Okay, and hopefully that makes sense as to why I used the index in this loop instead of for record in records or something to that effect. Because in that case, that would have been equal to a list and not the actual index, where I would have been able to return the current index I was at. Okay, so that will take care of the find index method function. Let's see. The next one here is to set the birthday. So this one's going to be a pretty simple, it'll end up being a very simple one, but basically what I need to do is I will have already found the index where I want to update the birthday. So all I need to do is reference inside the main list, right, index 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, if this was the list. I need to find, let's say I wanted to change the one for Monty. I would have index 2, so I need to reference this guy, and then I need to change the element at position 2, right, the third element inside that list. So all I have to do is, and I'm getting records, which is going to be this list of lists. So I'm going to go records at position index, which is given to me, at position 2 equals the new birthday. It's as simple as that. So what this is doing, I should probably spell that right as well, records at the index provided. So let's say it was 2, it's going to pull this list, right? So that whole thing returns this list. Now I need to look inside this list at position 2, right? 0, 1, 2, and then I need to change that value. So we'll just update it. And that one is done. That's really simple. Alright, the next one here is going to basically do the opposite of this load 2D array from file. So what this one was doing was it was taking it was taking all the text out of a file, putting it into a list. This one is going to take all the info from the list and put it into a string in order to write back. Okay, or it could even do a list, but we're going to do a string. I think it ends up being a little simpler. So we're going to create our resulting string, which should start out as an empty string. And remember, an empty string does not have a space in between the quotes. Either single or double quotes is fine. But with a space here, that's not an empty string. It's a string that has a space inside of it. An empty string has absolutely no characters inside of it. Okay, so we'll start out with that. That way we can add to it as we move along. So now what I need to do is I need to do for each row in records, which is coming from here. Okay. So what it's doing now, it's going to get this row. Okay. Now what I need to do is I need to take each element and add it to a list with a pipe in between. Okay. I'm going to show you what ends up being the simplest way to do this. It kind of doesn't, hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense. I'll explain what's going on, but it is a little bit of a strange syntax, so hopefully I'll be able to explain it clearly enough for you. So result plus equals, which is the same as result equals result plus some value, but just for the sake of simplicity, and it's a very common operator to use, just the plus equals. So result plus equals, and then what I want to do, since I want to join it on the pipe character, I'm going to do that dot join row. Okay, so I know it's kind of backwards from the way the split worked. Let's look at the split again here. So the split basically took a string value that had delimiters in it, and then split it on whatever the delimiter was. In this case, when you're joining it, you have to have the string that represents the new delimiter, right? And then you call dot join, and then you pass in some kind of a list object. And then what that'll do is it'll go through each element inside the list object and join it to the next element with this little character in front of it. It could even be a full string. If I wanted to do something like that, it would join it as Adam, then then Smith, then and then that value, the date of birth. But in this case, I want pipes in the middle, in between all of them. So that's it. And then remember how the encoding has the backslash, or the new line character, this \n. It has it in there. You can't see it, but we do need to add it in. Otherwise, you're just going to have a file that looks like that, or it's all going to be on one line. We don't want that. So we're going to do result plus equals, and we're just going to add that inline character back onto the end of the string. Okay, and that'll allow us to that'll format it correctly so that each one is on its own line. All right, so now we've constructed our output string. So now we just need to return it. Return the result, and you'll see why I'm returning these later. It's just a common way to go through these to define your functions with return values. All right. So now we've defined all our functions. We're loading the value, we can find an index, we can set the birthday with the given index, and then we can take the list of lists and put it back into a string to write out to a file. So now let's start doing the work, okay? So I'm going to do something like, let's see, records list, full list, you can call it whatever you want that makes sense to you. This is going to be the list that contains all the values from the file. And then we're going to set that equal to the value returned from the function, passing in the file path. That's the file path that I defined here, but you will need to pull from Codio. I think it should already be giving you these values, so you shouldn't have to mess with those at all. But just know that p is equal to the file path, so we're going to pass that into this function as an argument. Okay, it's going to take the name, as soon as this executes, it's going to take the name of file path. So then we can go ahead and open it, read it, and parse it, and then return a two-dimensional array or list, a list of lists. Okay. So now we have our records list. Now what we need to do is find the index, right? So find index given our records list, and then the first name to find and the last name to find. Okay. Now remember, since find index returns an index, it returns an integer, we need to store that somewhere. So I'm going to call it, I don't know, found index, something like that. So since this returns a value, we're going to set it equal to here. Okay. All right. Next thing to do is to set the birthday with the new with the index that we found. So we're going to pass in the records list. We're going to pass the index that we just found and the new birthday, which was B. Okay. Now, since this one doesn't actually return a value, if you look at my function up here, it just does something. It doesn't actually return a value. So we don't have to have that, we don't have to do anything like that and set it equal to something because, well, it's not returning anything. Okay, and then, so we've read the list in, right? We've got our list from the file. We found the index where we need to adjust the birthday. Then we set the birthday with that index that we found. Now what we need to do is, since we've modified our list, we need to get the string, or the formatted version that we can write back out to the file. So that's where we call this function. All right, and remember, since it's returning a string, let's go ahead and create a string output string. Sure enough. Sure, that'll work. Alright, so make text, and all it needs is the list of lists, records list. Alright, and you saw there that since I didn't have anything defined in as an argument, since I defined a parameter inside my function definition, Python makes sure that you have something in there. If you don't have anything in there, then it throws a fit. Alright, so now we have our output string, and that is the correct, hopefully the correctly formatted version of the records list with the modified birthday. And now all that's left to do is write that out to the file. So it's going to be almost the exact same thing as our read portion. So we'll copy and paste. Usually that works. We just have to change a couple things. So instead of reading, we want to write, and then we're going to call this write file. Works for me. And then we don't need this line, we need instead write file dot write and tell it what to write. Alright, so that should, oh, yep, you're right, I don't need file path here because that's not defined in this function. We need to, or defined in this scope. what we need to do is use that same file path that we used here. Okay, so the records list is being pulled from this file, and then we need to rewrite out to that file. Okay, and then remember the W write mode for writing will replace any content that is in the file. It will overwrite anything. Okay, and I have far too many indentations there. Alright, so that should do it. And you'll see, I mean, once you define your functions, the whole meat and potatoes of the actual script is, look at this, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. That's all that actually does anything. And then if you were to put all these functions into their own file somewhere else and just import that over, which is kind of what this is doing here, the import sys. I mean, this whole script could only be that long. That's all you would need. Well, of course, plus that stuff up there. But yeah, so you can see that the functions are great because you can just call them as you need them. They're all defined, and you just point at them as you need them. Super awesome. All right, so let's write this. And basically, what this is supposed to do is variable length records text. All right, so it's reading this file, and then what it's doing is it should find Adam Smithers and change the birth date to 0000. So you can see right now it's 10/10/1960. When I run this, it should change that to 0000, provided we don't have any errors. Let's see. All right, no errors, that's good. You'll also see no output because it didn't actually print anything to the console. Instead, the output went to the file. Let's make sure it's right. Haha, there it is. All right, so you can see that's basically the same application as the previous one with the fixed length records. This one just uses a delimiter, which is much more practical and extensible. You can just add things very easily. It makes the whole process a lot easier. And then using functions makes the process of building and maintaining the code that much better and easier as well. All right, so I hope that all makes sense to you. And there we go. That's more file input and output.